They say that Lebanon is a failed state, but I'd argue that's not actually true. I'd say it's more accurate to say that they've been failed by states. Despite being a land known for civil war, when you study the history of this country, it's quite clear that all of their greatest problems have always come from the outside. Since the rise of Phoenicia to the outbreak of the First World War, the lands that we now call Lebanon have been ruled by over 20 different empires. Be they Egyptian, Hittite, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Macedonian, Seleucid, Armenian, Roman, Byzantine, Sassanid, Rashidun, Umayyad, Abbasid, Fatimid, Seljuk, Crusader, Mamluk, or Ottoman, Lebanon has never truly been free. Nor, for that matter, has anyone ever really expected them to be. They're too small, too isolated, too important to their larger neighbors' plans. Even as those once great Ottomans were swept into the dustbin of history, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who genuinely proposed the idea that Lebanon might end up free. So as the world that they'd known for 400 years collapsed into a half-dozen unchecked genocides, the question on the minds of the Lebanese was not so much independence, but rather, who'd take over next? And in the backrooms of the Europeans who'd controlled virtually the entire world for over a century, of course that meant them. The political climate might have changed a bit since their colonial heights, but their arrogance certainly hadn't. And when they won this war, they'd expect its spoils. That's why they went to war. So despite what they'd tell their allies in Arabia, in 1916, those European members of that Entente agreed in secret on how they were going to divide the Middle East. From Anatolia to Iraq, it would all be theirs. Not that they'd mention that to the Arabs, of course. With the Ottoman army over a third Arab conscripts, a Pan-Arabian revolution would be no different from the British perspective than a genuine invasion from the south. And if a lie was what it took to inspire that, so be it. The Foreign Office even went so far as to help design their flag. But for that to work, they'd need a patsy, and in Mecca, they would find Hussein bin Ali. His Hashemite family had been the emirs of Mecca for as long as anyone could remember, which made him perhaps the greatest potential lightning rod for a Pan-Arabian revolution. Although it wasn't exactly clear what that would mean in practice, he was still willing to fight. Angered with the Turkification coming out of Constantinople and the minority genocides that it had been inspiring, Ali had lost faith in those Ottomans. The future, as he saw it, was independence. And so in 1916, he began to accept guns and gold from Britain in exchange for a promise that when that war ended, he'd be given a Pan-Arabian kingdom under a Hashemite banner. And what's more, he'd get to be caliph. When those young Turks deposed their emperor, taking his religious authority alongside, Ali would pick up that crown, and he'd eventually even be named the King of Hejaz, although he'd be much more interested in the concept of a caliphate, because without it, he'd never be able to conquer the lands that the British had promised him. His sons, Faisal and Abdullah, would be given their own kingdoms, although it would be fair to say that despite being one family, they were far from united in what their vision of the future would become. It was a precursor, perhaps, to the problems of what would eventually plague that Pan-Arabian dream. But it was as that king of Greater Syria that Faisal would make a historic deal with the leader of the European Zionists, defying the will of his own people to allow for a limited Jewish homeland within that now Syrian region of Palestine. His hope was that by giving the British a reason to protect him, they'd stop those ever-hungry French from eating his new kingdom in Syria, which obviously didn't quite work out. Less than 4 months after he was crowned, an ultimatum would come out of Paris: leave or die. And as the armies of France descended on his cities, Faisal chose life. But still somewhat loyal to the British, or at the very least now better understanding the futility of his position, he would be given the kingdom of Iraq, while his brother Abdullah would receive the Transjordan. Their father, however, wouldn't be so lucky. He wanted what he was promised. And in the post-war order, what he was promised was clearly never going to come. So from his base in Mecca, he refused the demands of the overconfident British, particularly in regards to Zionism. He wouldn't give an inch. But not wanting to anger his sons, who they'd just put on their thrones, the British would give him multiple chances to recant his opposition, and in every instance, he'd reject them. So, in 1925, Britain would find a family more willing to play ball. We now know them as the House of Al Saud. In the north, France would play their own games, conquering the mandates that they'd secretly been given during the war. In 1920, their army would roll through Damascus, destroying Faisal's fledgling kingdom and carving it up into bite-sized pieces. Unlike the British in the south, however, who aimed at coddling the Arabs in the hopes of winning their favor, the French had a different goal: suppress the majority, through whatever means possible, no less, and in turn embolden their minorities to help keep the masses from uniting against their control. Along the coast, they'd create a homeland for the Alawites, and in the desert, another for the Druze. The Syrian heartlands they would simply split into two. But in Lebanon, things would be a bit more complicated. As France's closest regional ally going back 1,000 years, the Maronites would leave the war expecting special treatment, which in practice, for the most part, meant farmland. More than guns, more than money, more than the assurances of European politicians, what the Maronites of Lebanon wanted most were farms. Half of all of their people had starved to death just 2 years before. So if they were going to feel in any way safe in this new imperial system, they were going to need enough farmland to feel like that could never happen again. And so that is precisely what France gave them. Rather than attaching it to the Syrian, Druze, or Alawite states that surrounded them, this new Lebanese mandate would be granted the areas of Bekaa, Beirut, and the Tyrian hinterlands. Not quite the full extent of the once mighty lands of Al-Din, but certainly the closest that the Maronites had ever seen. It's just, the thing about gifts is, they tend to come barbed. After all, these areas weren't exactly empty, and the people who filled them were for the most part Muslim. So, despite the fact that they all spoke Arabic and were therefore Arabs, in practice, that wasn't as uniting a concept as its proponents liked to pretend. Just beneath the surface were ideological and historical pains that simply couldn't be covered over with such a simple slogan. For many of the Christians, and even some among the Druze, the growing cries of Arab nationalism that were echoing across the region felt a bit more like threats than promises. But what was there to unite them with their new Muslim population but Arab nationalism? Now second class in a society that they had led for hundreds of years, those Muslims of this new Lebanese state began to look for a middle ground that might bring them back to that glory, and in that Arab nationalism, many would find it. Just like that, the first major split of this new state was already growing before it had even begun. To take those farms might have helped the Maronites feel safer from starvation, but it certainly wouldn't make it any easier to rule. Not that France didn't try, of course. The constitution they'd create would enshrine Christian preeminence above all others, splitting the remaining power down neutered ethnic lines. It wasn't quite as brash as what they'd done in Syria, but here in Lebanon, they'd divide and conquer all the same. The French would hand those Maronites control of a uniquely powerful presidency, and then justify it through their slight majority in population. But obviously, it was devised as a means of keeping control. But of course, above them all, France would retain their supreme power. It might have been pluralism on paper, but in practice, it was a quiet dictatorship. And so, as you might expect, it didn't quite work out as planned. Neither here nor in Syria, for that matter, who after being broken apart would find themselves coming back together in barely a decade. Nor, for that matter, would it work out in the south, where from the moment of its outset, the Mandate of Palestine would see nearly endless discontent. And although this is a story about Lebanon, I think it would be impossible to truly understand what came next here without talking at least a little bit about that mandate in the south. Because one can never truly comprehend the full extent of European dominance of this region, nor really the Arab nationalist response, without understanding Israel. So let's jump back to the late 1800s, the start of a great migration. A trickle of Jewish immigrants are arriving in response to the now seemingly endless European pogroms, especially those of Russia, and developing into tiny communities under the auspices of Ottoman Palestine control, which for a time was accepted with relative calm. As just a few thousand settlers who mostly kept to themselves, living in small, constantly failing collective farms, their threat to the standing Arab order was frankly more existential than it was practical. But by the 10s, and especially the 20s, with European hostility growing across the entire continent, the numbers of those willing to risk their lives in this new land began to dramatically increase. 5,000 became 10, and then 20, and then 50. And to those who saw nothing new in this land except those settlers, that changing set of demographics started to feel a bit more real. And before long, the Arabs would riot. Soon after that, they'd massacre. 1920 would see the first true hint of the problems yet to come. In a village called Tel Hai, Syrian Bedouins came hunting for what they believed to be hidden French soldiers. Having just lost their country to these new invaders, they saw little difference between the Parisians and the Prussians. Jews or not, they were all just Europeans in a place that they'd only just arrived in. To them, there was little difference. And so when they found nothing but farmers, confusion led to misunderstanding, led to murder. In 1921, that violence would increase. In Jaffa, Zionists protesting for a communist Palestine began a citywide brawl with their competing socialists. And sensing that as an opportunity, Arab nationalist mobs began to break into unrelated Jewish businesses and homes, killing dozens of unsuspecting civilians. A pogrom in all but name. As more settlers flooded into the country, that pressure only increased. Despite a vast majority of both sides still aiming to live in peace, still believing in a world together, echoing in from those fringes had started to come the cries for war. In 1929, a far-right mob of 6,000 Zionists paraded through the streets of Jerusalem carrying proto-Israeli flags and demanding that the Wailing Wall be theirs to control. Led by a Lithuanian who'd fundraised on doctored pictures of the Al-Aqsa Mosque being replaced by a Jewish temple, many Arabs saw this as confirmation that the Zionists had no intention of ever living in a free Palestine, that they were meant to be replaced just as soon as those Europeans had the power to remove them. And from that fear grew a belief amongst some of those Arabs that the only way forward would be violence. And so yet again began a massacre. By the start of the 1930s, that pendulum of sectarianism had started swinging beyond any one person's control. That trunk of Arab nationalism sprouting new limbs of violence. And that once extremist view of exiling or murdering all Palestinians started to gain prominence. Eventually, even popular support. It was a feeling that would only increase once their brethren were forced to face one of history's greatest atrocities, a horror so awful it is almost unimaginable. The Shoah, the Holocaust. The run-up to that great evil would see a migration of European Jewish populations towards every corner of this globe, but nowhere quite like Palestine. Here, those fleeing masses would come in numbers that would have changed any country, let alone one already on the brink of war. From 1930 to 1940, even with Britain suppressing their arrival as much as possible, the Jewish population of this mandate would triple. Which means in just 10 short years, the number of European settlers here rose from an 11th of the population to nearly a third. Which I suppose can be hard to fathom, so perhaps it requires a comparison. To achieve similar numbers in America, you would need to see 130 million immigrants over the next decade. That's 10 times the largest number that has ever been allowed in. In Europe, it would be like if Germany took 30 million Syrians during the recent civil war. The question isn't if it was moral to do so, but rather how it changed things when it was done. In Palestine, it caused an enormous shift, both in the size and scale of the already burning problems raging across the Mandate. To the pre-existing people of this land, whose culture had dominated since 630 AD, this new wave of European immigration, however justified it might have been, was simply too much to bear. The once tolerated Zionist request for a home within their home had genuinely started to feel like a threat to their home's existence. I mean, in 1932, Palestine was the only Arab mandate that Britain hadn't granted its independence yet, which had started to feel a little less coincidental and more like a deliberate ploy to give their home away. It wasn't, granted. As the old saying goes, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity, and imperialism is often nothing if not stupid. In reality, Britain supported neither Zionism nor the Pan-Arabian identity, at least not truly. They'd secretly backstab either of them any time it was in their interest. In their truest heart, all Britain ever really wanted was control. And if it took a lie or a massacre to obtain that, so be it. By 1936, the people of Palestine had had too much. The perpetually mounting fear and anger and repression sparked a revolt amongst those Arabs that turned into a full-blown civil war. A 3-year struggle of violence and depredation that to some was a fight for freedom and others a fight for control. It was a confused yet passionate sectarian national uprising meant to remove that British influence and obtain their independence. And of course, once those British were gone with their hated police alongside them, it would allow for an expulsion of these now seemingly endless Jewish settlers. Except Britain wouldn't be shaken off so easily, and with a torrent of state violence in response, they'd retain their control of this tiny Levantine mandate. It's just the times were changing. And with Germany growing in power in Europe, the threat of a Pan-Arabian revolt was as great to those British as it had once been to the Ottomans. And so, sensing that war to come, in stepped famed diplomat Neville Chamberlain, the hero of Czechoslovakia. In 1939, his government suggested a compromise. Jewish people would be given a formal homeland within the overall state of Palestine, but it would comprise no more than 5% of the country. Both sides would leave furious. Neither Arab nor Zionist would agree to those terms, and so the British walked away looking weaker than ever. To the people of Palestine, this would be a truly historic failure. Everyone understood what it meant. The Empire of Britain was done. And 5 years later, with Germany having killed European power in a great murder-suicide, it would be the Zionists' turn to revolt. In 1944, hardened by their international Holocaust, they would start attacking British positions with a form of guerrilla warfare now almost exclusively referred to as terrorism. They would bomb railways, ships, government offices, and police stations. They would assassinate. And as that rebellion grew, the people of that once great island decided that they'd had enough of war and demanded that their government prepare plans to leave. Emboldened by their successes, the Jews of Palestine began to flex more than they had ever dared before, their public statements no longer suggesting a willingness to live within a state that they didn't control. They would create an Israel, a homeland for their people. And so as that rebellion continued to grow in violence and the mandate above them lost control of the state, it became clear to all sides that the true war had begun. Weary and tired, Britain would formally hand control of the region to the UN, who would in turn attempt to solve this growing crisis by splitting the mandate into two. But just as with Chamberlain before them, all it really did was further embolden those militants. Without troops on the ground to stop them, the partition would do little except further spur each side's violence. But now with a state to work from and a legal backing for their cause, each would attempt to expand their borders with as much ferocity as their people could manage. But this is a story about Lebanon. And back up north in their own mandates, French attempts to sustain control would be just as ineffective as those of the British. By the mid-1940s, both Syria and Lebanon would declare their independence and join what was then called the Arab League. It was the region's newest attempt at solidifying a pan-nationalist union, but just as with the Hashemites before them, a union really only works if its leaders are united. And Arab nationalism was little more to them than a front. Although many within their kingdoms would both fight and die for that cause, more than anything to the leaders above them, the only thing that they'd ever let unite those Arabs would be them personally taking charge. Which is exactly how they joined the war for Palestine. Although a union on paper, each army would remain split and untrusting, each aiming to conquer their own piece of this newly broken land. None seemed truly concerned about the return of an actual Palestinian state, but rather the inclusion of that state within theirs. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, united on paper, divided they would fall. So despite having a vast majority in population size, it was a war that those Arabs would ultimately lose. And when the dust finally settled, that new Israeli state would control not only all of the land that the UN had given them, but 60% of the Palestinian lands alongside. They call it the Nakba, the catastrophe. Half of all Palestinians would either flee or be coerced and forcibly expelled from their homes. Others would be slaughtered in a violence that's only being recognized in the modern day. Their wells would be poisoned and their villages burnt to the ground. 700,000 civilians would be removed from their houses, their history, and their land. Few would ever return. In the Arab states who surrounded it, the anger of that loss would quickly become an unmanageable cancer in the national psyche. And so both the governments and their people would in turn inflict unprecedented violence against their country's Jewish populations, despite them being completely innocent of what had just happened in Israel. Over the next few decades, this purely evil sectarian revenge would force yet another major migration towards that nascent Jewish state. What had once been a fringe idea of the far right had now become a practical reality. Palestine was dead, and now was the era of Israel. But again, this is a story about Lebanon. And whether it was Israel's intention or not, it would be the pressure of that great exodus that would forever change the face of this country. Hundreds of thousands of refugees disrupting that delicate balance that the French had imposed just a half-century before. The question wasn't if it was moral, but simply how it changed things when it was done. And before too long, Lebanon would begin to teeter and collapse. Soon enough, there would be war. And it would take 15 years of hell before they could find their way back out of it. But more on that next time. This is Rare Earth.